Cheyenne and her husband arrived at the campsite at Cossatot Falls, eagerly anticipating their much-needed vacation. As they set up their tent and built a campfire, Cheyenne couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was eerily silent, without any of the usual sounds of nature. Cheyenne's husband assured her that it was just her imagination, and they settled in for the night. As they drifted off to sleep, Cheyenne was jolted awake by the sound of rustling leaves outside their tent. The noise grew louder, and suddenly the tent was shaking violently. Cheyenne screamed as her husband fumbled for a flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the couple was left in darkness, panting and terrified. As they tried to calm their nerves, they heard a faint whispering sound. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, but the words were too quiet to make out. Cheyenne's husband called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. Then they saw it. A figure was standing outside their tent, barely visible in the moonlight. It was hazy and translucent, like a ghost. Cheyenne's heart pounded as the figure approached the tent, reaching out a hand that went straight through the fabric. Cheyenne and her husband were frozen with fear as the ghostly figure floated through their tent, inspecting their belongings. It seemed to be searching for something, but they couldn't tell what. Finally, the figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the couple shaken and bewildered. The rest of the night was spent in a fitful sleep. Every time they woke up, they were convinced they could hear whispers and footsteps outside their tent. As the night wore on, Cheyenne and her husband heard more and more strange noises outside their tent. They heard footsteps shuffling around their campsite, as if someone or something was stalking them. The forest was so silent that even the sound of a twig snapping echoed loudly in their ears. Cheyenne tried to calm her racing heart by telling herself that it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She felt like there were eyes on her every move, like something was watching them from the shadows. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. Cheyenne's husband called out to the source of the sound, but there was no response. They heard the sound of a low growl, like that of an animal, but it was unlike any sound they had ever heard before. Cheyenne's husband tried to reassure her that they were safe, but it was clear that he was just as frightened as she was. The couple clung to each other, waiting for the night to end. But the worst was yet to come. In the middle of the night, they were awakened by a piercing scream that echoed through the forest. It sounded like a woman in terrible agony, and it went on for what felt like an eternity. Cheyenne and her husband were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. When the screaming finally stopped, they heard the sound of footsteps rushing away from their campsite. They waited until the first light of dawn before venturing outside their tent, and what they saw made their blood run cold. There were deep scratches on the trees around their campsite, like something had clawed at them in the night. And in the clearing nearby, they found a pile of bones that looked like they had been picked clean by something inhuman. Cheyenne and her husband knew then that they had encountered something that was beyond their understanding, something that they were lucky to have survived. They packed up their belongings as quickly as they could and left the campsite, never to return again. Years later, Cheyenne still has nightmares about that night in the woods, and she still hears the screams echoing in her mind. She knows that whatever they encountered that night was something that should never be disturbed, something that was far more terrifying than any ghost story she had ever heard.